Good morning and welcome to the 33rd meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2020. We have received apologies this morning from Alex Cole-Hamilton. Can I ask all members and witnesses to ensure that mobile phones are on silent and all other notifications are turned off during the meeting? The first item on our agenda this morning is subordinate legislation, consideration of a draft affirmative instrument. It is for the Health and Sport Committee to consider this instrument and report to Parliament accordingly. We will have an evidence session with the Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing. Once we have asked any questions we have, we will then have the formal debate and motion following the evidence session. The instrument we are looking at today is the Feed Transfer of Functions Miscellaneous Amendments Scotland Regulations 2020. These regulations make provisions to transfer functions for execution and enforcement of feed law in Scotland from local authorities in their areas to Food Standards Scotland. As highlighted in the committee paper, Food Standards Scotland carried out a consultation with stakeholders from 28th of August to 20th of November 2017 alongside local authority and industry focus groups, and a further public consultation took place from the 13th of May to the 8th of July 2020. A consultation report is available on the Food Standards Scotland website. So I welcome to the committee this morning Joe Fitzpatrick, Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing, who is accompanied by Ivan Boomer, Solicitor with the Legal Directorate of the Scottish Government, and by Jacqueline Angus, Workstream Manager on Feed, Brian Campbell, Regulatory Strategy Programme Manager, and John Scott, Lead Feed Officer at Food Standards Scotland. Can I thank the Minister and his officials for joining us today and invite the Minister to make an opening statement. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to join you this morning to consider these regulations. This instrument aims to transfer real competence for animal feed law functions from local authorities to Food Standards Scotland on the 1st of April 2021. This step has been taken to address a number of concerns relating to a significant reduction in the level of inspection and sampling activity across Scotland. Since animal feed safety has a direct impact on the safety of food for human consumption, this is clearly a matter that needs to be addressed. Local authorities are currently competent authorities for feed official controls. The delivery of animal feed control functions is carried out by 31 trading standards services across Scotland. There's been a steady decline in the number of inspections and sampling visits carried out in Scotland as required under EU official control regulations. Local authorities have also reported reducing numbers of qualified and competent staff entering and remaining trading standards, increasing numbers of feed businesses in Scotland, and competing priorities with other trading standards functions such as doorstep crime and product safety. Although Scottish ministers and FSS have powers in this regard, the issuing of a direction would have been unlikely to change the overall situation and would most likely have resulted in resources needed elsewhere being redirected to respond to the direction. Instrument amends a number of existing feed instruments, change the competent authority from local authorities to Food Standards Scotland, as the convener said. It provides for the delegation of functions from FSS to qualifying third parties, and FSS intends only to delegate official functions, inspections and sampling to third parties, with the option to delegate some investigation and enforcement powers in an emergency. From the 1st of April 2021, any outstanding issues on this date will remain with the local authority until completion. Considering the current low levels of feed law activity, the likelihood of there being any such work in progress is expected to be minimal. Work began developing the new model in 2015, and over the last 5 years, regular stakeholder engagements have taken place with feed industry, local authorities and other regulators, allowing FSS to develop a new model that is effective, robust and sustainable. In recognition of the qualifications and experience that already exists within local authorities, FSS intends to use authorised officers for delivery under delegation where they are willing and have capacity to do so. The new model is supported by the industry to meet their needs and provides consistency across Scotland and a more level playing field for Scottish feed businesses. As well as regular engagement with industry and local authorities, there have been 2 formal consultations in 2017 and 2020, as the convener said. The development of the infrastructure and governance for feed is currently taking place in collaboration with relevant stakeholders. I hope members agree that these regulations are necessary to provide an improved official control regime for animal feeds, and that they agree that the necessary changes to existing SSIs transfer competence from local authorities to Food Standards Scotland. This change will support enhanced levels of protection of human health, consumers' interests and protection of animal health and welfare. Consistent and increased levels of delivery will minimise risk at all stages of production, processing and distribution of feed products for or fed to food-producing animals. This is particularly important in the run-up to the UK's exit from the EU, and we're of course happy to take any of your questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Minister. And can I invite members who have questions to indicate by placing an R in their chat button now. Minister, if I could start off by asking you, you mentioned that local authorities will continue to deliver in practical terms where they have the qualified and appropriate staff, continue to deliver some of the functions they deliver at the moment. Can you confirm that local authorities are content with this change in responsibility?
Yes, this has been really very much a collaborative effort with local authorities in order to make sure we have the best and most robust system. Obviously, FSS is developing its own competences to deliver feed controls directly. However, it does feel appropriate for local authorities, those local authorities that have capability and capacity to participate in delegation, as it retains the skill and local knowledge. For any local authorities that are participating, officers will also still be able to carry out other functions, so things like food, primary product inspections, animal health and welfare at the same time, and that will therefore minimise footfall and regulatory burden to the many feed businesses. But this is very much a collaborative project.
Thank you very much. I have questions from Sandra White, followed by Emma Harper. Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister and others also. Thank you very much for your replies to the questions that we asked. One of the issues I wanted to ask about is obviously is the framework fit for purpose? And I noticed your reply to our letters, but we do have concerns of the Internal Market Bill, and I just wondered how that would affect it.
I suspect, Sandra, you're looking to put that question in relation to our discussion on common frameworks, which will follow this one immediately afterwards.
Apologies.
So keep your powder dry, and I'm sure the Minister will be forewarned that you're going to put that question to him.
Apologies, Convener.
No problem.
And Minister.
Emma Harper.
I bet I have a really good answer to that one.
You surely will. Emma Harper.
Thanks. Good morning, Convener. Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Minister. In some of the work that we've been doing, as I'm a member of the Rural Economy Committee as well, we've been looking at food and feed and SSIs as well. So, and I have asked a couple of questions in the past about maximum residual levels or levels of pesticides or veterinary drugs in food and agricultural products. So I know that there are different ways that food is produced in the United States. They use more antibiotics, they use more pesticides, and have different levels that are acceptable in the US. So I'm interested to know if it will be Food Standards Scotland's role to monitor the food and feed and the produce that comes into the UK with specific in regard to the residual levels of antibiotics, for instance, or steroids that are used in meat production.
Minister.
Well, thank the member for the question. And obviously, when we were developing this proposal, it was not really with the shadow of Brexit in mind, and I think in normal times it was something that it was right to do. It was about making a more robust system. I think the issues that the member suggests in relation to Brexit, I think makes it more important that we have a consistency of approach. Obviously, this is specifically about the food and feed stocks for products here and livestock here. But Jackie, do you want to add anything around that?
Jacqueline Angus.
Hello, thank you, Convener. I would say that since we started developing the model, we have obviously been aware of the impact of the exit from the EU, and the model that we are developing does include enhanced import controls. There's a lot of work ongoing at the moment to approve border control posts, and import controls is a key part of the work that we're doing at the moment.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Okay, so I mean, my thoughts are that we need to be vigilant of the different production and processing methods that are used in other countries, so that when food enters our supply chain, that we are cognizant of issues of antibiotic resistance and the use of higher levels of antibiotics in dairy cattle, for instance, in America, and other issues of one called Carbamax, which is used in the production of pigs. So I'm assuming that there will be continued monitoring as trade deals and trade negotiations move forward.
Thank you. In responding to that, Minister, could I also ask you to comment on any relevance or impact of the removal of the EU regime as such from the distribution of powers between FSS and local authorities that's contained in this instrument? Minister.
So I think in terms of your latter point, I don't think that specifically is impacted in this SSI. I think in relation to moving from 31 different competencies to a Scottish competency, I think it makes sure that for these new and potentially challenging issues that Emma Harper has raised, that we can quickly develop the appropriate expertise across Scotland, and that will be mainly in FSS, but also working with those local authorities which clearly have a large number of producers in their area. So therefore there is the level of work in order to make sure those competencies, but particularly the new challenges that the exit from the EU brings, there will have to be new competencies and new expertise developed to make sure that we're alert to that challenge.
Thank you very much. There are no further questions from members, so we now move to agenda item number 2, which is the formal debate on the made affirmative SSI, on the affirmative SI, on which we have just taken evidence, which is the Feed Transfer of Functions Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2020. Can I remind the committee and others that we are no longer asking questions of the Minister. Officials may not speak in the debate. It's simply that the Minister will move a motion and members will then, if they wish, contribute to the debate. Can I invite the Minister to move the motion S5M 23298? Joe Fitzpatrick.
Formally moved.
Thank you very much. Can I ask if any members of the committee wish to contribute to debate on this instrument? If not, and the Minister has nothing further to add, then we will put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5M 23298 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes consideration of this instrument, and we will report to Parliament accordingly. And can I thank the Minister's officials for their attendance in his support on this matter. The third item on our agenda today is an evidence session on the provisional UK Common Framework on Nutrition Labelling, Composition and Standards, following our first session on this framework at last week's meeting. As was said last week, these common frameworks have been developed to ensure the rules and regulations in given policy areas remain consistent across the United Kingdom following our exit from the European Union. And our role is to scrutinise those common frameworks that fall within the remit. The committee has taken the view that we have a role both to influence the content and to monitor the application of these common frameworks, and of course also to be a conduit between stakeholders and the Scottish Government. And the Scottish Government has indeed requested that we as a committee provide our commentary on the content of the framework. Last week we took evidence from stakeholders on the framework. This week we will take evidence from the Minister, so I welcome again to the committee Joe Fitzpatrick, Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing, who this time is accompanied by Ewan Page, Head of UK Frameworks at the Scottish Government, and by Sam McKeown, Head of Food and Feed Safety Policy at Food Standards Scotland. Welcome to you all. And again, if I may invite the Minister to make a short statement on the framework. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. Again, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me here today to assist in your deliberations of the Provisional Common Framework for Nutrition, Labelling, Composition and Standards. Officials from Food Standards Scotland have been involved throughout this process, alongside officials from the Department of Health and Social Care, the Welsh Government and the Food Standards Agency in Northern Ireland. The framework itself is one of a number of provisional common frameworks that will come before the Parliament, and is part of a programme which my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Constitution and UK Relations, has coordinated for our interests, and therefore supported today by officials from both Food Standards Scotland and the Scottish Government. This has been a hugely collaborative effort, demonstrating genuine cooperation and engagement between UK administrations. This framework has been identified as a priority for agreement by the end of this year, in order to ensure that those functions that are currently undertaken at an EU level are delivered in a coherent and robust manner when the transition period ends. The committee have asked why you're seeing this framework now and why not alongside other frameworks relating to food, and that is a consequence both of the approach by consensus which we have agreed with colleagues across the UK, as well as wider pressures, not least the current pandemic. And I can assure the committee that the framework will not be finalised until all UK legislatures have had an opportunity to consider it in full. Nevertheless, excellent progress has been made in this framework, one of the first to go before the Parliament for scrutiny, and I consider that it will ensure that repatriation of EU functions relating to nutrition and health claims made on foods, the addition of vitamins, minerals and certain other substances to foods, composition and labelling of food supplements, composition and labelling of food intended for infants and young children, food for special medical purposes, and total diet replacement for weight control will all be delivered to a high standard. The framework has followed agreed protocols for framework development and includes agreed UK processes for making policy recommendations to ministers, as well as governance and dispute resolution arrangements. It's been developed in accordance with the Joint Ministerial Committee for European Negotiation principles, which were agreed by all administrations in 2017. That includes the principle that UK frameworks should both ensure the functioning of the UK internal market, as well as acknowledging policy divergence, and that they should respect the devolution settlements and the democratic accountability of the devolved legislatures. On that basis, we consider that this framework delivers against the principles agreed in 2017. And I hope the committee found my reply to your letter of the 17th of November helpful. And of course, I'd be happy to answer any further questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I'll start off with a reference to your reply to that letter, simply to establish a matter in relation to SI notifications. Your letter dated the 30th of November stated there were 2 SI notifications from the Government to the Parliament relevant to this specific framework. Now, we as a committee have considered numerous such notifications to date, and we're still awaiting correspondence from the Government on several of these, confirming that the instrument has been made in the UK Parliament. Our calculation, I think, is that we're awaiting 16 out of 39, but can I ask the Minister to confirm which notifications we still have outstanding correspondence for, and confirmation that we will receive these before the Christmas recess? Minister.
So, I'll maybe ask Ewan just to come in more detail. I think the 2 instruments that I was referring to in the letter to the committee, which are 2 which we expect to update the committee on before recess, So those are the Food Amendments EU Exit Regulations 2019. That's a DEFRA SI, and then also the Food and Feed Safety and Hygiene EU Exit Regulations 2020, which is an FSA SI. But I don't know if Ewan's able to enlighten the convener on any further SIs that the committee should be expecting longer term, or if that's something we're better to write to the committee on.
Ewan Page.
This may be a question more for my colleague Sam in Food Standards Scotland as it relates to SIs that fall within FSS's remit.
Sam McCure.
Hello, yes, thank you. I can confirm that the two SIs relating specifically to this framework, so the ones relating to nutrition, have both been completed and have been notified to the committee. As the Minister said, there's a couple of ones for FSS on the DEFRA SI and on the food information and composition matters and the food and feed safety hygiene that are in process at the moment. Wider SIs will be the responsibility of others across Scottish Government, so that's maybe something we need to get back on and collate a response across Scottish Government on that one.
Thank you. That would certainly be helpful. And Minister, I think you suggested that that might be the way forward as well, that you would respond in writing to that. It would certainly be helpful to the committee to know what else we should be awaiting. And essentially it's the outcomes of the SIs and whether and when they are tabled in the UK Parliament, I think. Progress. Thank you very much. Moving on to other matters, the question around consultation is the next one I would like to ask, Minister. There is some evidence, we heard from our witnesses last week, for example, that they were consulted either late or not at all, and we wondered as a committee whether there was a culture of framework development happening before people are consulted and whether more should be done in order to engage and have participation from stakeholders. Minister, what is your view?
We obviously will pay close attention to the comments and the evidence that you had, just to check we've got this right, but stakeholder engagement is an essential part of the framework development process. In general terms, industry have considered that the framework was supportive of business and considered that it would deliver consumer confidence in the process. However, I guess it's only the stakeholders with a specific locus in this policy area that were contacted. So I think from the evidence session last week, I think some had interests in other areas such as organic food production and novel foods, which wouldn't have been contacted as part of this framework because this framework doesn't cover those areas. But we obviously pay close attention to the evidence that the committee receives, and we'll make sure that we feel that we've got that engagement process, the balance correct, because it is absolutely really crucially important that we get these frameworks forward in collaboration with our stakeholders.
Thank you. And what you consult on is the most recent version of the framework, is that correct?
Yes, I think so. I think we've consulted in general terms as well, and so it's that kind of wider to help influence our discussions with UK partners.
Thank you very much. And finally, from me for the moment, can you outline to the committee the interplay between the framework itself and the accompanying Concordat?
The Concordat is an agreement between ministers at the high-level process and principles that will apply for matters within scope. It covers approaches to communication between parties, as well as setting out escalation procedures. The framework outline, which follows a common template, provides answers to more detailed operational aspects. So I guess that's the difference. So the Concordat's at the higher level, and the framework's more the kind of detail, and it's essentially been used as a tool for developing the formal high-level arrangements set out in the Concordat. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I think essentially to understand how changes in one will affect changes in the other. I think what you've said is certainly helpful. I'll now call on George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. The nutrition-related labelling composition and standards framework is one of a number of frameworks that are in the food nutrition policy. There's obviously food, feed and safety and hygiene and food compositional standards and labelling framework. Now, Minister, there's quite a lot involved in all this, and there's quite a lot for us to go through. Is there any way, in your opinion, that we could find a way that we could have a competent way of going forward, but at the same time give the committee and others that are involved the opportunity to make it simpler for us all to go through this mire of legislation?
Minister.
I think we're doing our best. We are absolutely clear that the work of the committee is absolutely crucial to all of this process. So I think it's really important that we share as much as we can with you as the committee. Your role is absolutely crucial in all of that. I think maybe one of the points to remember is that the frameworks themselves are policy neutral, so they build on established ways of working across government and provide those principles committed to within them are adhered to, then most of the concerns should be mitigated. So it's really important that all four administrations adhere to the principles, but I think it's important to remember that overall the framework isn't about changing policy now, it's about how we can look at making changes in the future, respecting the importance of the devolved settlements across these islands.
Georgia.
Thank you, Convener. On that point, Minister, there's a difference of opinion between yourselves in Scottish Government and UK Government, in so much that the UK Government want to legislate on much of the framework, whereas you don't believe that's necessary. Can you maybe talk me through that?
Minister.
Yeah, and as I say, this has been probably one of the most collaborative approaches across the four administrations. So I don't want to put words in the UK government's mouth. It would really be for them to answer. However, as far as I'm aware, neither the UK government nor FSS officials have identified any areas where legislative underpinning would be required to deliver a framework meeting the principles for their development agreed back in 2017. The Internal Market Bill, however, maybe takes that to a different place, and there's real challenges there in which would suggest that standards set by the UK government would be able to apply in Scotland irrespective of any recommendations made under the framework. So in relation to everything that's happened with the framework, it absolutely fits with all of the principles of respecting devolution. The Internal Market Bill really does drive a horse and coach through that, and so there's huge concerns about that. But in terms of what we're agreeing today, I think we're content that this is a robust process which respects the different devolved arrangements.
George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Just one final question, Minister. Is it not important, the Internal Market Bill is obviously a concern for us all, but is it not important that the consumer understands the new system before implementation? Do we not make sure that we ensure that, you know, when we move forward with this, it's a way for something they understand and they've got an opportunity to engage with?
Minister.
I think probably going back my point that the framework itself is and should be policy neutral. So in cases of changes to policy and regulations should be undertaken with care, of course. But the actual framework is policy neutral. Clearly, in the future, there could be changes coming underneath that, and they would be really important that they get the proper scrutiny, and that's the process that the framework supports.
Thank you very much. I call Emma Harper.
Thank you. Good morning again, everybody. I'm interested in some issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol and the interoperability with that. The the internal market bill includes a broader market access principles, which would mean that irrespective of policy determinations in this framework, ministerial decisions taken in each country would only be binding on the products produced in those countries. And I'm interested, I've got a couple of questions around just that last week we heard testimony from the Food and Drink Federation that many food and drink businesses will halt exports to Northern Ireland for the months following 31st of December. Do you have any concerns, Minister, as to the interoperability of this framework and the Ireland and Northern Ireland Protocol, and how would you reassure businesses?
Minister.
So matters relating to trade don't fall within my brief, and I think it would be difficult to offer any reassurances to business in current circumstances. I think everything around the EU exit has been challenging and unpredictable, but even in our worst nightmare almost, I don't think we'd expect it to be here at this stage discussing these frameworks without knowing what the final settlement is going to be and what the arrangements for trade would be. So that's a real challenge for industry. I guess in relation to this framework, it is a 4-country agreement, so hopefully that gives people in industry in particular some reassurance that we are looking to develop consistent approaches here. And clearly the specific matter in terms of related to Northern Ireland, that obviously EU legislation would continue to apply, EU regulations in Northern Ireland. That interface means that we all will have to consider that going forward on a 4-country basis.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Minister. I know that stability for our businesses is something that we absolutely aspire to and support. I think we're about 24 days to go till the end of the EU transition. And so I'm always in the back of my mind wondering if we're ready for it or if we will be ready for it. But last week we heard, or I read a report that there's a 21-month proposed adjustment period that has been proposed for goods placed on the market in Great Britain to reduce the impact of the change in requirements, taking the deadline for compliance to 30th of September 2022. So that might be something that allows businesses to have a bit of time to prepare for labelling changes requirements. Is this something that the Minister can update the committee on and explain how it might link to the common frameworks before us today?
Yeah, and I think it's the point about stability is actually really important. So the requirement for health and identification marks is set out in food hygiene regulations, and that's subject of the food and feed safety and hygiene framework rather than this one. But that provision which allows businesses to continue, that the member mentioned, it allows businesses to continue to place goods with existing EC marks on the GB market is a transition measure. And it just makes sure that those goods wouldn't be rendered useless, and so it keeps those marks legal until, as the member said, September 2022. So I think it's an entirely pragmatic approach, and in line with the member's starting point about providing some stability.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks again. Just a final question. Would any of the proposals in the UK's internal market bill conflict or constrain the effect of this framework or the ability to action this framework? I'm concerned about some of the aspects of the internal market bill.
Minister.
Yeah, any framework covering the setting of any standards in relation to goods, including food, is affected by the internal market bill. So the Scottish Government sees that bill as the biggest threat to devolution since 1999, and we will vigorously oppose it at every turn. It's fundamentally inconsistent with devolution, centralising control in the UK Government and the UK Parliament, cutting across devolved powers by imposing new domestic constraints. And it's also unnecessary because common frameworks can address any domestic market issues that may arise as a consequence of EU exit. And so the Scottish Government will support common frameworks where they're in Scotland's interests and where they are agreed, not where they're imposed.
Thank you very much. And I now call Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Minister, and others as well. I started off, unfortunately, obviously coming in at the wrong point, but I'd just like to pick up on that particular issue, and it's to do with the Internal Market Bill and obviously the Common Framework, where your replies, which have been excellent to the letter that we sent in regards to fit for purpose. Now, obviously, it's been raised with the UK government that there were some concerns, and I note in your reply, Minister, you say you're still awaiting a satisfactory answer. Could you give us an update on that? Have you had a satisfactory answer to the concerns that you raised in the letter to the UK government?
Minister.
Well, I actually exactly the opposite. So obviously I've been clear that the Internal Market Bill is not good. It doesn't respect devolution. There's a huge amount of issues, and it actually really is threatening the powers of the Scottish Parliament and you as a committee to be able to influence decisions under that. And the reason I'm really disappointed in terms of the update I'm having to give is that, as I understand it, last night the House of Commons reinstated all of the changes made by the House of Lords, and some of those would have given primacy to the frameworks, and as I understand, that was all removed in the Commons last night. I haven't had a full report of what was agreed, but the Internal Market Bill is a real threat to devolution, and anything that was done in the House of Lords to try and mitigate that was to be welcomed. But as I understand, the House of Commons has just reversed all the potentially positive changes to that bill and put it back to a piece of legislation which is, I think, a serious threat to the devolution settlement, and also unnecessary, because this framework, when operationalised, I think is able to deal with the issues that the UK government were trying to deal with by the Internal Market Bill.
Sandra.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for that reply, Minister. It sort of leads me on to one of the questions I was going to ask, and basically, I don't know if this could be possible now that obviously it's been passed with breaking international law as well in the Internal Market Bill, but do you think, as a Minister, Scottish Government, the Internal Market Bill should be amended to give primacy to the common frameworks? Would that be possible, or is that the thoughts?
So I think our starting point is that the bill is not necessary, but if it's going to be necessary, then the sorts of amendments which were carried in the House of Lords, which did do, as the members suggest, give primacy to the frameworks, would have definitely been better. But I'm hugely disappointed to have heard that those were reversed in the House of Commons.
Sandra White.
Thank you. And do you think that obviously what's happened from last night and any deal that may still go, because it's going to be a ping-pong ball between House of Commons and the House of Lords, I understand, back and forth. Do you think, how will it, what is your assessment basically of how it will affect or constrain the common frameworks or any partnership with the European Union? Will that constrain this framework, what's happened in that regard? Or any other policy areas that you're perhaps developing?
Minister.
So we'd obviously it'd be a far better position if we were sitting here agreeing this framework, knowing deal, no deal, what the details of arrangements will be. However, the intention, I think, was always that the framework would be amended for being applied post-transition in order to accommodate whatever the circumstances around the deal would be. So I think that remains the case. And I think another point to remember is that the framework is not a requirement for, if you don't have this in day one, then there's a particular issue. It's about ways of working going forward once the transition period ends irrespective of the deal in place. But and just go back to the point that I don't think any of us would have expected to be at this point and not have more clarity than we currently do.
Sandra White.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. And now, obviously, we have the continuity bill, which is going through Parliament, and there is the keeping pace principle of that bill. How will the Scottish Government apply the keeping pace principle as set out in the bill to this and other common frameworks?
Minister.
So I think I kind of maybe just touched on this earlier, but obviously the framework's a four-country agreement, so intended to drive consistent approaches across these islands while acknowledging policy diversion. It's clear that any changes to EU law will require to be considered through the framework, given that EU law will continue to apply in Northern Ireland. Obviously, the Scottish Government has set out our view that the law in Scotland should be aligned with EU law, and where such alignment would be appropriate and in the best interests of Scotland. But obviously, that the specific issue in relation to Northern Ireland means that the framework has to consider those issues.
Sandra.
Yes, thank you. It's quite a difficult one. I understand that particular one. And you mentioned the EU law and obviously the Northern Ireland Protocol. Who will have responsibility for monitoring any of the ongoing changes in regulations and practices in regards to the framework? And obviously we know it's Scots law in practice. Who will have responsibility for overseeing this?
Minister.
So there's no change to the way in which laws will be made arising as a result of this framework. Where changes to EU law are required to be made, they will be made either by Scottish statutory instrument or UK instrument if consent is given by the Scottish Parliament. So in relation to those matters, there's not really there shouldn't be a change based on this legislation. So provisions for making such changes to retain the EU law is contained within the UK fixing legislation.
Thank you, Minister. And this is my last question. Now, we heard concerns last week, and Emma Harper touched on some of the concerns which were raised with the food and drink industry about workforce capacity issues. I think you did mention that in your reply earlier on to the convener. For regulators, particularly in local authorities and in Food Standards Scotland, can you reassure the committee on this point that we won't be badly affected in regards to the concerns that were raised about lack of, local authority costs, etc., and the Food Standards Agency as well?
Minister.
So, unfortunately, I can't give reassurances regarding the impact that Brexit will have in Scotland more generally, but I'm acutely aware that with new demands, for example, in relation to the provision of export health certification, which Emma Harper mentioned earlier, that there will be increased pressures. The advice that FSS is currently recruiting and anticipates being in a positive position to deliver its statutory requirements on excess. But I think we need to be alert to the fact that a large number of official veterinarians working in meat plants in particular are EU nationals, and changes to immigration rules could mean that future recruitment or staff retention becomes difficult. These are points which we've repeatedly made to the UK government, but will nevertheless try to mitigate. There's a particular issue in relation to those official veterinarians. It's a particular training programme which I think most such veterinarians who work within the UK will have been trained in Europe. So there's a real challenge there which we need to continue to be alert to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister.
Yep. Now call Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. I just have a question as a follow-up on the internal market bill. I appreciate there are strong views held on this, and it won't surprise you that I take a different view to you. But that aside, it is likely that this bill will become law, will pass through Parliament, whether amended or unamended in its current state. And I just wondered, given that FAC, what is the Scottish Government's view as to how it will interrelate with this common framework?
Minister.
So as I said earlier, we're really concerned that as it stands, the bill drives a horse and coaches through the framework. So that's a real concern. However, these frameworks have been developed in a collaborative way across the four nations. So, you know, in terms of the frameworks, as long as the frameworks are allowed to function as intended and as agreed, respecting devolution, then, you know, the frameworks are really robust. That's why there is actually no need for the internal market bill as proposed at Westminster. And as I say, you know, there were some amendments that were passed in the House of Lords which softened the challenge on the bill towards devolution, but as I understand last night they were all reversed. Now, we obviously all know the parliamentary processes can be complex, so it may be that UK ministers are considering further amendments that will respect those issues to the bill, and I certainly hope so. As I say, the drafting of the frameworks, and this one in particular that I've got most knowledge of, has been a very collaborative process across the four nations, and I think that's the strength of the framework.
Donald Cameron.
Thank you for that, and I'm glad to hear about that collaborative work. Can I turn now to the role of this Parliament, Scottish Parliament, in implementing and monitoring this common framework? What do you see as the most useful role that the Scottish Parliament could play, and how should we measure the success of the framework?
So, as I said, I think in relation to a question from the convener, I think the effective parliamentary scrutiny is an essential element to all of this, so pre and post implementation monitoring of all of the common frameworks. The operation of dispute resolution mechanisms, for example, and any issues identified would be an essential element of that scrutiny process, and that's important for us all. In terms of success, well, our focus in the first instance will be to try and ensure that public health remains protected and that there is no diminution of standards once we leave the EU. So I guess that's a really important measure of success, top measure of success in this particular framework.
Donald Cameron.
Thank you for that. Do you have any thoughts as to what are useful trigger points to allow for parliamentary scrutiny? So, for example, I think a House of Lords committee suggested that the annual report of the activities of the NLCS policy group might be a moment at which Scottish parliamentary scrutiny kicks in. I mean, is that a typical event that might trigger scrutiny?
Minister.
So Scottish Government officials are still working with parliamentary officials, the pre and post implementation scrutiny across the frameworks. But for this framework, there will be an annual report, which, as you say, might be an appropriate starting point for the committee. So I think in principle, yes, but I understand that there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes between our officials and the Parliament's officials to make sure that scrutiny is as robust as it should be.
Indeed. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener. My final question is simply to ask if you know when and how you expect legislation to flow from this particular framework.
Minister.
Well, I think most likely it will be triggered by industry, in terms of submission of health claims. That's most likely the thing that will trigger applications. Other actions, such as considerations by the UK Nutrition Health Claims Committee, might also be triggers. But I think that's. I don't know if Sam or Ewan, you wanted to add anything around that.
Sam McKeown.
Yes, thank you, Minister. Yes, just to really confirm what the Minister said there. The trigger points will mainly be where we're seeing authorisations or applications coming through for authorisation of new health claims. That's probably going to be the first area we see, and also if there's any amendments which could be triggered by changes in technology, science, or developments in public health. So those would initiate our normal policy process. We wouldn't expect to see, because there is a process to go through when we do the risk assessment and then the risk management for these areas, we wouldn't really expect to see any legislation coming forward, I would say, for at least 3-4 months, maybe six months, but to give us time to do these processes. And obviously we will be looking at the best way or the most efficient way to kind of combine, if we can do quarterly, when it comes to, if we might be looking at doing quarterly instruments to make these changes, rather than as and when they happen, to try and make the process more efficient for everyone.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister, and to your officials. I think one of the things where I want to come from is really the implementation of the framework and what the impact can be. I mean, I think sometimes we forget when we're legislating, what we're looking at is impact on individuals and the people that we represent. You and I, Minister, are obviously very much keen on the health of individuals and the health of the nation. So looking at the framework and what it covers around the nutrition claims and health claims, and food for specific groups and food supplements, etc. Can I ask initially, where do you think the opportunities are within the common framework to help the Scottish Government to improve the health of individuals within Scotland? And an addendum to that, if I could, is that we're waiting on the Good Food Nations policy coming through, and how the framework could be utilised within the Good Food Nation policy.
Minister.
So, as I think I've said before, the framework itself is policy neutral, so any changes to law need to be considered through the wider prism of government's aims in relation to some of the issues that you and I share particular interest in, and also Good Food Nation. So the framework itself is about us discussing with the other UK administrations and legislatures how any changes that we choose to make would impact across the piece. And to be fair, in most of the matters that Mr Whittle and I share particular interest in terms of that health agenda, there is already very good collaboration and discussion, sharing of best practice, sharing of longer term aims, and I have relatively frequent discussions with my counterpart at Westminster, Joe Churchill, on such matters, and these are never matters, and as it never is between myself and Mr Whittle, these are never matters for party politics as such. It's about looking to see how we can use our legislation to make a difference to people's lives.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Minister. I do completely agree with you there, Minister, that I think the health of the nation is not a matter for party politics. But I'm just interested. I know we discussed the Good Food Nation policy in Parliament. It's been coming for a while, and I was particularly interested in how this legislative framework sits across the top of that. But can I ask then, if there are particular issues that might be there for the food and drink sector in Scotland as a result of the proposed arrangements, and if there are any issues, how you propose that these will be mitigated?
Minister.
In and of itself, there shouldn't be issues for industry, so we'll continue to actively seek the views of those affected by potential changes in law and policy, and the decision-making processes at the heart of this framework make sure that is transparent. So in and of itself, I don't see the framework causing industry any issues. It might actually give them some reassurance to know that there is a process in place whereby changes that we're making in the Scottish Parliament, for instance, are cognizant of issues elsewhere in these islands.
Thank you. I now call David Stewart.
you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and officials. The Minister will be aware that last week we took evidence from Professor Paul Haggerty, and he said, with regards to dietary reference values, which the Minister will know is used in the labelling of foods, he felt that this was a test. Does the Minister agree with that?
Minister.
So, those nutritional aspects of the general food labelling rules, they're included in this, rules are included in the scope of this framework and will become retained GB law, ensuring a status quo at day one. However, we'll look again at the wording on scope to see whether further clarity needs to be made. As I said earlier, we listen very carefully to all of the deliberations of the committee and listen very careful to the comments that Mr Haggerty made in those regards.
David Stewart.
Thank you, Minister. I think in light of the evidence from last week, that would be very useful. Again, keeping on evidence from Professor Haggerty, he said in evidence that he was concerned about the omission of novel food. And again, for those listening, novel foods I would define as foods that don't have significant history of consumption in the UK. Can the Minister address these concerns?
Minister.
So, first of all, I apologise to Professor Haggerty for not giving him his correct title. So, novel foods fall within the scope of the Food and Feed Safety and Hygiene Framework, which is also coming before this committee for scrutiny. So that's why it's not within this one. So hopefully that answers that.
And what would the timescale be for that, Minister?
I think that framework is with you.
Yes, it is. It's arrived, but we haven't yet considered it as a committee. So that's a matter for future business. David Stewart again.
Right. Thank you, Minister. I'll bear that in mind when we're considering that particular framework. Just two further questions. What role has this in the establishment of the new UK Nutrition and Health Claims Committee?
Minister.
So, sorry, let me just get some timings for that. So the recruitment process for the scientific experts was conducted by Public Health England, which I think members will be aware of. And so that took place at the end of 2018 in preparation for a no-deal exit. At that time, obviously, didn't come about. And Scottish Government policy officials in all of the devolved administrations were involved in the process as part of the framework development and consideration of procedures for risk analysis and decision making. Panel members, in spite of the fact that the no-deal Brexit didn't happen, panel members were then initially appointed in February 2019, but were held back in the background should the committee be needed, and members were formally announced in October. So I guess, and policy officials from each of the 4 nations will have observer status at the committee meetings, but we've been involved in the committee since its inception way back in 2018.
David Stewart.
And I'm sure the Minister would join with me in welcoming the Scottish representative, who's Professor Harry McCardle, who was the Deputy Director of the Rowett Research Institute. But I'll move on, that's an observation rather than a question. My final question is, how generally will Scottish scientific expertise feed into the ongoing assessments about the category of food and additives contained in the framework?
Minister.
So obviously the committee would publish its scientific opinion, and I think at that point there's a 1-month statutory consultation. Scientific opinion would then inform the policy group risk management assessment and recommendations, and that I think would then go to the FSS board, and unless it's just a technical matter, obviously, but if it's assuming it's something substantive, that evidence from scientific opinion would go to FSS board, and the FSS board would then present recommendations to ministers for decision. So I've maybe put that in a slightly convoluted way, but hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you very much. And I have a brief supplementary question from Emma Harper.
Thanks for allowing me in, Convener. Just when we talk about novel foods, on the back of Dave Stewart's question, I read recently about laboratory-grown chicken, and that's happening in a restaurant in Israel and in Singapore. So if we're talking about novel foods, would this be something that would be included in the frameworks that we are going to be exploring in the future?
Minister.
Yeah, so as we've said, not this framework. I think it's probably out with any briefing I've had is to comment on the thoughts of the lab-grown chicken meat. Maybe I've had a wee hint of one of the questions you're going to ask me when the next framework comes forward.
We'll look forward to that discussion when it arrives, and I now call David Tollins.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and colleagues. One question around nutrition and health claims process. Are you reassured that the role of the scientific evaluation is adequately catered for in this proposed process for assessing nutrition and health claims and for requests related for other categories of vitamins, minerals, food supplements and foods for specific groups?
Minister.
Well, yes, I mean, and that's the role that our scientific community and UK scientific committees have in relation to providing technical advice on a range of matters, and I think it's absolutely appropriate to assume that will be a robust assessment, which will then help us make policy decisions.
Thank you. And a question from George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister again. Last week I asked a question of stakeholders regarding the NLCS policy group, and they expressed a need for expertise in that policy group. How will the Scottish Government go about ensuring that we do get that expertise on the policy group?
Minister.
I think that is really important, but as I say, I think that happened, and there was an open and transparent recruitment process for the scientific experts led by Public Health England, but Scottish Government officials were involved in that, or maybe FSS, sorry, back in 2018. It is hugely important, and there's always a concern that one of the unintended consequences of Brexit, and one that I know Dave Stewart in particular has raised on numerous in numerous other fora, is the impact on scientific skills and that the ability and movement of scientists and the ability to collaborate across Europe. So that's one of the challenges. But in terms of the process that was carried out, it was an open and transparent recruitment process.
Thank you very much. George Adam, are you happy with that answer?
Happy with that, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, then, my final question, Minister, is in relation to the dispute resolution mechanism. We've heard evidence that the mechanism as it currently stands does not provide a specific role for the Scottish Parliament, nor is there an approach embedded into the process that encompasses all the devolved administrations. What would the Government's view be on the dispute resolution process and the involvement of Parliament? Minister.
Thanks. Dispute resolution is intended to be a four-nation approach with equity between parties, notwithstanding the particular issues in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's largely a matter for disputes between administrations, so it should be the case that disputes are resolved before measures are laid in Parliament. But should legislation be laid in one Parliament before a dispute has been resolved and laid in another, then clearly that would constitute a breakdown of the framework process, which I know that certainly if it was in relation to the Scottish Parliament, I know that yourselves and other committees would look at that very, very seriously. I think it's probably worth just highlighting that I think there's reference in the framework, the wording to the Secretary of State taking the final decision in a dispute. But to be clear, that wording that as published, doesn't accord with the wording that has been agreed, and I understand that that will be rectified in the final text before it is agreed. So from what's published, it might look like there's a particular final role for Secretary of State, which is not something that's been agreed.
Thank you very much. And just to be clear, that while you're on the subject, are there any other changes of substance that are in the final text that are not in the framework that we've seen today?
If there is anything else of any substance, we will obviously make sure that we alert the committee to that and write as quickly as we are aware of anything.
Thank you very much. And can I thank the Minister and his officials for your attendance this morning, which has been very helpful in our continuing consideration. We will consider this further later in our meeting today, but thank you in the meantime, and we will move on in a moment to the next item of business. Thank you very much. The fourth item on our agenda is a Stage 1 evidence session on the University of St Andrews Degrees in Medicine and Dentistry Bill. It is for the Health and Sport Committee to consider this bill at Stage 1 and report to Parliament accordingly. And last week we took evidence from key stakeholders on the bill, and this week we will hear from the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport. And so I welcome to the committee Jean Freeman, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, who is accompanied by Carmen Murray, the bill team leader, by Stephen Lee Ross, the Head of Workforce Practice, and by Magdalene Boyd, Solicitor with the Legal Director. Welcome to all of you, and can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement on the bill. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to you and to the committee, and thank you for inviting me to give evidence on the University of St Andrews Degrees in Medicine and Dentistry Bill. I heard with interest the evidence presented to the committee during last week's evidence session, and I'm grateful to those who gave evidence and to all of those who've responded to the committee's call. The bill has a single purpose and is technical in nature. It seeks to remove an archaic, unfair and arguably anti-competitive prohibition which prevents the University of St Andrews from awarding medical and dentistry degrees, a prohibition that was intended to be temporary and is no longer needed. The prohibition was put in place in the 1960s as a transitional provision in order to give immediate effect to the separation of Queen's College in Dundee from the University of St Andrews in order to form the University of Dundee. That purpose has clearly been achieved. No other higher education institute in Scotland or in the UK is prohibited by primary legislation from awarding degrees in any discipline, and it is clear that the 1966 Act did not intend to prevent future competition between St Andrews University and any other higher education institute in Scotland or indeed in the United Kingdom. The bill will therefore embed a fairer higher education sector and enable all of our valued institutions in Scotland to maximise the options they offer to students. The particular timing for us bringing forward this legislation is to enable St Andrews University to award, jointly with the University of Dundee, PMQ medical degrees to ScotGEM students in advance of the first cohort graduating in 2022. ScotGEM is Scotland's first graduate entry programme for medicine. It formed part of a package of initiatives announced by the Scottish Government in 2016 to enhance the NHS workforce of the future. It's delivered in collaboration with the University of the Highlands and Islands and a number of partner health boards, and has a specific focus on general practice and remote and rural working, and aims to retain as many doctors as possible within NHS Scotland following their graduation. I heard concerns raised during last week's evidence session, and I would like to clarify that although the University of St Andrews may well have an ambition to offer its own PMQ medical degree in the future, the bill will neither determine nor provide for this. Whether any higher education institution is able to offer a degree in either of the controlled subjects of medicine or dentistry, the number of places it might be able to offer, if so, is subject to separate financial and regulatory controls and decision-making processes that involve the Scottish Government, Scottish Funding Council, NHS Education Scotland, the General Medical Council, and of course look to views from our boards. The prohibition is therefore not required in order to prevent the university from awarding its own medical degree. As the University of St Andrews has, together with the University of Dundee, already been awarded the ScotGem programme, then the immediate effect of the bill would be to allow for the university to jointly award the ScotGem PMQ degree with Dundee University. And as I know you heard last week, that is clearly the expectation of those students who enrolled for this very special course and hope to graduate shortly. The committee heard last week how passionately ScotGem students feel about their unique identity as students of both universities, and it is fair and right that they are able to graduate with a jointly awarded degree reflecting the studies they are undertaking and the incredible work being done by both Dundee and St Andrews universities to establish what is a very innovative programme. That is all I have to say at this point, Convener. I'm of course very happy indeed to take any questions that members may have.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned that you'd listened to the evidence, and you said also that the bill neither authorises nor provides for St Andrews University to go beyond the current training that is provided and education that is provided to offer its own PMQ, which is true, but of course it does enable that to happen. And the context for that, as we heard clearly last week, was the proposition that there should be a new medical school somewhere in Scotland. So I guess the two concerns that struck me most clearly were, first of all, one raised by Professor David Maguire, the principal of the University of Dundee, who felt that Scotland did not need another medical school as such. And also we heard from Aberdeenshire Health and Social Care Partnership, whose concern was that if a new medical school was established in the Central Belt, it would have an impact on the recruitment and retention of medical graduates in the north of Scotland. I wonder how you would respond to those concerns, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Convener. And of course, you're quite right. The passing of this bill, removing that prohibition on St Andrews, the only one of our institutions in the whole of the UK that has such a prohibition, of course, would then enable St Andrews, if it wished to put forward a case that should government introduce a new medical school, an additional medical school, as our 2019 programme for government indicates, then St Andrews, along with all the other universities who offer medical undergraduate education in Scotland, St Andrews could then put forward a case that it or St Andrews, jointly with another institution, would house and offer that new medical school. So it doesn't, removing the prohibition that this bill seeks to do, simply allows St Andrews to be part of that discussion on the same basis as all the other higher education institutions in Scotland that have medical schools. And whilst I know what Professor Maguire argued in terms of this bill, he has also argued for additional medical undergraduate places, and with his colleagues elsewhere. So he's not arguing against the fact that we may want to have additional medical undergraduate places. He's simply arguing that they should go to his university or one of the others. On the contrary, the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Edinburgh University sees no such difficulty or problem with this bill in terms of how his university is placed as a deliverer of quality medical undergraduate education. And we've not had any such concerns expressed by any of our other medical schools. In terms of the concern from the Health and Social Care Partnership, my officials have had quite long discussions with them. And of course, as I know you know and members know, the whole process of establishing another medical school or an institution going through that to become approved to deliver a medical degree is a long process. The degree programme has to be developed. There has to be funding secured for those additional controlled places. Clinical placements need to be secured that do not, and GMC is very particular about this, do not detract from what else is offered by established medical schools. GMC needs to accredit a new medical school, and then there is obviously ongoing GMC regulation. So it's not immediately in the offing for any of our higher education institutions. We had begun the work to look at what propositions might come forward. All were invited to give us those, but then we paused that work inevitably as we had to respond to the COVID pandemic, and we've not yet finalised, because we're still in the middle of that pandemic, when we can pick that work up again in order to move it forward to honour the 2019 Programme for Government Commitment. So
and can you...
it's the case that if you remove this prohibition, then St Andrews, on its own or alongside another institution, could come forward and make a case and offer a programme to say that any new medical school should be housed with them. This is not inevitable, and they would have to meet all of those requirements, but also the government of the day would also have to take a view as to whether what was offered there was better compared to what may be getting offered by other medical undergraduate courses and institutions.
Thank you very much. And can you explain briefly why it is the Scottish Government's preference to create an additional medical school rather than additional places at existing medical schools, and also what you anticipate the impact on recruitment and retention in the north of Scotland might be if a new medical school was established elsewhere?
So just on the latter point, of course, University of Highlands and Islands has expressed a real interest in being part of discussions around the possibility of a new medical school. So I don't think we should assume that should there be a new medical school, that it will go anywhere in particular at all. What we were interested in doing was looking to see whether, partly in the spirit of what we've seen in ScotGem, although no one should take that to imply that we favour either Dundee or St Andrews for any future location, should there be one, but partly to see whether or not there was more that could be offered, either from existing medical schools or from a combination of existing medical schools or those with others, so with the University of Highlands and Islands or with St Andrews, or indeed in terms of the Crichton campus in the southwest of Scotland. All of those bodies were in that discussion to see whether or not we could widen access to Scottish domiciled students in remote and rural areas and encourage their continuation in terms of, once qualified, working for the NHS in Scotland. And you'll know that the ScotGem course has a particular aspect to it, which is the bursary on condition that you work for the NHS in Scotland in your foundation year. Now, that is a particular test, if you like, to see whether or not that would put off students. It self-evidently has not. And so it gives us information, if you like, and evidence to consider whether in the future that may be something that we consider as part of any increase in medical undergraduate places.
And very briefly, why a new school rather than these other options that you've discussed of building on existing?
Well, the Programme for Government says we would like to have a new medical school, but clearly my mind was open to to how we might achieve an increase in medical undergraduate places, and what we would secure from that was addressing some of the issues in terms of our medical workforce across the country, because we had discussions, both officials and I had discussions with existing medical schools as well as with Crichton Campus, with University of Highlands and Islands and with St Andrews, all of whom came forward with propositions that they wanted to make, clearly existing medical schools arguing the case that any additional places should go to them. And we hadn't got beyond that before we had to pause the work and begin the response to the COVID virus.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Can I now call on David Torrance?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, can you explain why a partial removal of the prohibition was ruled out?
Cabinet Secretary.
Because I believe two reasons. One, I think it's very clear that the prohibition was always intended only to be temporary, and I am simply following through on that intention. And secondly, I find the prohibition either there in full or in part fundamentally unfair. I think it is unfair on any academic institution to be prevented from offering a degree which is a controlled subject compared to their counterparts elsewhere. And there's also an implication, I think Andrew made this point about the additional implications the prohibition has on their capacity to undertake research in these areas. And of course, we know that in medical and life sciences, Scotland is very well placed in terms of research, but I don't want one of our institutions to be prevented from playing the fullest possible part it can in that. So I see no reason for a partial removal when a full removal simply opens up opportunities, both in research, but also removes an unfair fettering of one of our institutions compared to their counterparts elsewhere in the UK.
David Torrance.
Cabinet Secretary, could prohibition be amended for the purposes of ScotGem and then amended further in the future if need be?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I suppose technically it could, but I don't see any reason why we would go through all that fuss and bother when there is no good reason that I can see or argument that I have heard that would say that we should remove the prohibition in part. I think we either remove it in full or we don't remove it at all. Now, my argument is it was never meant to be in place for as long as it has been, in truth. It was always intended to be transitionary. We should follow through on that because there's no good reason not to. And we should remove it in its entirety because there is no good reason that I have heard that says you should only remove it in part.
Thank you very much. I call David Stewart.
And good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. I have a few questions.
I'm not sure if Mr. Stewart's connection is perhaps a little awry. Perhaps we'll come to Emma Harper and then come back to David Stewart if we can. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I listen with intent at the establishment of a potential new medical school, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary mentioning the Crichton campus a couple of times, because I know there's a lot of interest in establishing a new medical school, being affiliated with maybe one of the established ones and being placed in a rural area like Dumfries and Galloway. And Professor David Maguire talked about 80% of the students that attend University of Dundee come from deprived areas, and I know that widening access is really important, especially for me in Dumfries and Galloway. I'm interested in the Cabinet Secretary's thoughts of whether the inclusion of St Andrews University, with its prestige as one of Scotland's ancient universities, could that limit progress on widening access by attracting a different demographic to the ScotGem programme, for instance?
Cabinet Secretary.
So this bill is not about a new medical school. This bill is about removing a prohibition that, should there be in this government or a future government significant moves beyond those which I have initiated but necessarily paused towards the new medical school to provide for additional medical undergraduate places. St Andrews, if you like, can compete equally in that field to any other of our medical schools that currently exist. So it's not about a new medical school, it's about removing a prohibition that currently cuts one of our higher education institutes out of that discussion. Now, one of the areas, and to go back indeed to the convener's earlier question about why did government think this was something to be discussed in terms of a new medical school, part of that was an understanding that widening access is about more than ticking the box about which areas of deprivation your undergraduates come from. It's also about making practical steps that make participating in higher education more feasible. And that is clearly the case from some of our very able students in Ms Harper's own area, in my own constituency, I'm sure in Mr MacDonald's and Mr Stewart's constituency. In other words, our more remote and rural areas out with the central belt of Scotland. It is more than simply looking at the home area that a student comes from, but how do you practically make it more likely that they can enter that kind of degree of higher education and sustain their participation. And that's why in the early discussions around this, I was keen to involve University of Highlands and Islands, hear what they had to say, but also hear what Crichton Campus had to say. So I think that we need to understand what widening access is. None of our institutions, if I'm completely frank, I have said this to all of them when I met them, has as good a track record as I need to see in terms of widening access for medical undergraduate courses, and we need to do more. But it's not simply about putting, if you like, the burden on them to tick the right boxes. It's also about thinking creatively about how do you deliver an undergraduate degree, a medical degree, in ways that widen your access to all your potential students. ScotGem is an aspect of that, but it can't be the exclusive one.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that clarification. The ScotGem course, for feedback that I've had so far, is that it's doing really, really well, and the students are doing, they're great as far as engaging in the coursework and the learning and everything that is part of their programme. And I know that the ScotGem students come from different backgrounds, like pharmacists and dietitians. Do we have a breakdown of those that are currently undertaking the ScotGem course, so that we can show that actually these healthcare professionals that have degrees already could then, it allows us to encourage more people to then participate in ScotGem in the future?
We do. I don't have that with me, but I'm very happy to make sure that that is made available to all the committee members. And of course, the other aspect about the ScotGem course is the involvement of GPs themselves as clinical educators, which I know the students in the ScotGem course, and indeed the GPs themselves, highly value and are very keen to say that that is something that we should consider in other aspects of medical undergraduate education.
Thank you very much. I now once again call on David Stewart.
Apologies, Cabinet Secretary. I've put a pound coin in the meter, so hopefully I'm able to speak to you again. You may have got my question about my bid for a new medical school in the Highlands and Islands in conjunction UHI, Dundee and St Andrews, but that was more an observation. I'm very enthusiastic about ScotGem, and I do believe it will have a vital role in retention and attraction of rural GPs in Highlands and Islands and across Scotland. But you'll be aware of the student survey from within ScotGem. It said nearly 98% wanted to support the coming from, or ScotGem coming from both institutions, of the students' views on this.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I have seen that. I mean, the students, I think, take a perfectly fair and reasonable position, and that is that when they enrolled, when they secured their place, not straightforward to do, when they secured their place and enrolled on the ScotGem course, they did so on the basis that it was a joint award from both University of Dundee and University of St Andrews. And they are very enthusiastic, and I know you heard very passionate about the quality of the education they're receiving, their experience, but also that the award should be a joint award, because that's the basis on which they entered it in part. So I am very keen that we make sure that the prohibition is removed in order for that to be possible. And as I said to Mr Torrance, I don't see the point of, if you like, footering around with partial removal and then maybe full removal at some point in the future. It doesn't seem to me to get to the fundamental point that it is unfair that a transitionary prohibition put in place to be transitionary is not removed in full, and one of our institutions can then compete and be on an equal footing with all their colleague institutions elsewhere in Scotland and indeed the UK.
David Stewart.
So, Cabinet Secretary, would it be fair to say then that having it as a joint degree is a remarkable selling point for it, and if we don't get the bill through, this could affect demand for the course in the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I mean, I have no absolute hard data to confirm my response to that, but I think what we have heard from successive student enrolment makes it pretty clear that the high calibre of students who are being attracted are attracted because of the nature of the programme, which comes from it being a joint exercise, and they are attracted at being potentially graduates of both universities. So all of that would make me think that if it wasn't a joint award, then that would have an impact on its attractiveness to futures.
And my final question, Cabinet Secretary, whilst of course you can't make future commitments to the committee, this is a great success, this course. Scottish Funding Council would obviously have a view if the course numbers were going to be increased. But what's your general view on this? This is a Scottish success. Could it be increased so this would really help demand, supply and demand for not just GPs, but particularly GPs in rural areas?
Cabinet.
So you're absolutely right, Mr Stewart. I can't make forward commitments, but I can tell you that I am hugely enthusiastic about the ScotGem course and how it has played out since it was introduced. It has a number of very innovative aspects to it that are working well, not least the conditional bursary that I mentioned, the clinical educators from our GP community. And one of the things I think we're seeing anecdotally in feedback, although we'll be able to track that more definitively as we go forward, is that those ScotGem undergraduates undertaking their clinical practice in GP practices in remote and more rural areas become hugely enthusiastic about the opportunities for exercising and increasing their skills as young doctors in those remote and rural practices. Now, that is always something we want to try and overcome, this notion that the only place that it was exciting to practice as a GP was in an urban setting. Undoubtedly, it is exciting, but I am a firm believer that there are a whole range of enticing intellectual and skill challenges to doctors in remote and rural areas, and ScotGem is helping us demonstrate that.
Thank you very much. And I think a little further on the same question from Stephen Lee Ross. I'm not sure if Stephen Lee Ross is to try again. No, perhaps not. Perhaps not. If that is resolved before the end of the evidence session, we will come back to you. Can I move on for the moment and call Brian Whittle?
Yeah, A lot of the focus actually of the bill has been around degrees in medicine, but it would also allow the University of St Andrews to award degrees in dentistry. But neither the policy memorandum to the bill or any of the written submissions explore the potential impact on dentistry. So can I start by asking why dentistry is included in the bill?
Cabinet Secretary.
It's included because if you recall, I can't find it, and maybe one of my colleagues, if they can come in, can explain this, but it talks about medicine, dentistry and midwifery, and that really is taken from that act in the 1960s that imposed the prohibition in the first place. That prohibition was on those three. Generally speaking, midwifery at that time was actually about obstetrics. That's how they described it. And of course, obstetrics is now part of the undergraduate degree as a whole. We don't do a separate one, although there would then be specialisms and so on. And so it was part of what was originally prohibited, and therefore the prohibition that we lift, it covers all of those.
Thank you very much. And I think Carmen Murray wanted to add something on that point. Carmen Murray.
Hello, yes, thank you, Convener. Yes, I just echo what the Cabinet Secretary said. So the full prohibition contained in the 1966 Act relates to medical and dentistry degrees, both of which are controlled subjects. So the rationale around removing the prohibition and it not being determinative of the university's ability to award either medical or dentistry degrees applies. And also the Cabinet Secretary has explained to the committee that we've heard no reason or rationale to leave any part of the prohibition in place because it does no longer serve a purpose in today's context and it was intended to be transitional. So it will put the University of St Andrews on the same footing in law as any other university in Scotland, and it just makes sense to remove the prohibition in its entirety rather than leave any part of it in place.
Thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Just a follow-up to that then. I mean, in lifting the prohibition, presumably the considerations have been given to potential benefits in medicine and also in dentistry to lifting of that prohibition. So perhaps ask the Cabinet Minister, Cabinet Secretary, to shine a little light on the benefits he feels will be to dentistry in Scotland. Cabinet Secretary.
So the potential benefits are the same as to undergraduate medicine in terms of allowing St Andrews, if it wished, to be able to move in that direction. But again, as our Bill team leader said, this is a controlled subject, so there is the same significant degree of effort, regulatory body and work that needs to go in order to get to a point where any institution is considered an awarding body for dentistry as it would be for medicine. So all this bill does is remove the current prohibition on St Andrews University from considering whether or not it might want to do such a thing as offer a medical undergraduate degree in full or a dentistry undergraduate degree in full. But then even if it did wish to do that, then there are a whole number of steps that it would need to go through and requirements it would need to meet, including the impact of any additional places in any of those areas to other existing dentistry or medical schools, alongside not just the places, but also the opportunities for the necessary clinical practice in the field that is part and parcel of what students need to go through in order to graduate. So it is, as with medical places, it is a separate question. All the bill does is take away the current block on St Andrews from being a part of that consideration, if it wishes to, alongside its counterpart institutions in the rest of the country.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. At the end of this, Cabinet Secretary, the outcome is what we're looking for here is obviously to the benefit of the medical and dentistry degrees within Scotland. And last week we heard the issues around, concerns around the impact for other medical schools about recruitment and retention of doctors. And we've obviously discussed this much at length in the chamber. And that there is a set quota around the number of medical students, local medical students that can be recruited, if you like, into these universities. So I think one of the concerns last week I heard was this, in effect, may just spread the same number of health professionals across more universities. I wonder if you could comment on that, and also whether these concerns around that impact can also be applied to dentistry.
Cabinet Secretary.
So there is quite a detailed process goes on in terms of determining the number of places in these what has been described as controlled subjects, and that includes ourselves as government looking at what we anticipate will be the workforce requirements for doctors and dentists. In this regard, we do the same exercise on nurses and other members of our health professions, and then looking at what undergraduate places we've got, what will be the flow through, what is going out, if you like, at the other end of the profession in terms of people retiring and so on, and trying to balance it so that we get both an increase in numbers, as we have done in recent years, and a reasonable flow through. Now, in that circumstance, all the medical schools want to maximise the number of places that they have. That's perfectly understandable, and that is why the existing medical schools made a case to me that if there is to be a new medical school, they would rather there wasn't a new medical school, but the additional places that may go to a new medical school should go to them as existing medical schools. A perfectly reasonable case for them to make. No decisions were reached for all the reasons that I've described earlier. Our interest in looking at that, as well as looking at what should we have a new medical school instead, is, I guess, twofold. One, we have to make sure we have the right number of undergraduates going in to meet what we anticipate as they flow through the years. They take a while to produce these doctors and dentists as they flow through. That A, we can offer them the clinical placements that they need as part of their undergraduate education, and B, we're going to get the right numbers out at the other end, working in Scotland to meet our anticipated workforce demands. That's first thing. The second thing is, can we do more as a government with the levers that we have to widen both access, but also widen the throughput into those areas of our country which traditionally struggle to recruit and retain. So that would be GPs in remote and rural areas. It will also be doctors in particular specialisms, and you'll know from the information we publish about the traineeships, how we try and use that to fill what we anticipate are gaps, either because of retirement numbers or because we're putting greater emphasis, for example, in mental health. So that's the whole process and exercise that we go through in order to ensure that we put into medical and dentistry education the numbers that we anticipate we need to come out the other end to meet what we think will be our workforce requirements. Now, we've increased medical undergraduate education. We pulled back a little before on undergraduate education for dentistry. We consider all the time each year how we need to flex the numbers. But what we have said is this year there are more medical undergraduate places as a consequence of the decisions that were made around the higher results this year. What we've said in funding those places is that the additional numbers this year are not at the expense of any young people coming through school this year who are applying to go to medical school. So we will have increasing numbers, and we will have increasing numbers as we go forward, because the balance of our medical workforce is such in terms of the age profile that we will, I anticipate, need to increase steadily our medical undergraduate numbers. So we won't be spreading. It's a short answer, Mr Whittle, my apologies. We won't be spreading the same number across a bigger patch, if you like, should we have an additional medical school.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Just finally, Convener, if I may, obviously there's a lot of chat around the potential for a new medical school. Would the plans then, if that was the case, would that also include a new dental school in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Not necessarily. There has not been a case made to me that we do need a new dental school in Scotland. We have, as you know, Glasgow and Aberdeen. Aberdeen's relatively new, I seem to recall, well, relatively new, in the course of devolution, Aberdeen Dental School. So I've not seen a case for that. That doesn't mean a case doesn't exist. But what colleagues need to appreciate is, whilst it had been my hope that from the 2019 programme for government commitment, we would undertake the initial discussions I've described, we'd receive the proposals, we'd have a good look at all of them, and we'd take a view on whether or not we needed to put additional places into a new school or not. Obviously, that's all been paused, and the amount of time left in this current parliamentary session, although I do intend to pick this up and move it on a little, is so limited that we're not going to reach a final view, I don't anticipate, before Parliament rises for the next set of elections.
Thank you very much. I'll call Carmen Murray, and then I will call Stephen Lee Ross to come back on a previous question. Carmen Murray.
Hello, thank you, Convener. Yes, I would just add to what the Cabinet Secretary said in terms of there being no case for additional undergraduate dental places, that part of our workforce work and planning, it hasn't shown that there's a need for additional dental places. At the moment, we've got dental undergraduates that work across Scotland as part of their clinical placements in Stornoway, Campbelltown, Inverness, Dumfries. So there's no evidence at the moment that there's any requirement for additional dental places.
Thank you very much. And then in reference particularly to the previous question from David Stewart about the future of ScotGem, can I call Stephen Lee Ross?
Thank you, Convener. Just to note that in response to the question about number of places allocated to the ScotGem programme, the allocation has already increased from 40 to 55 in recognition of the contribution that that programme is making across the board. We're currently in the process of convening the medical undergraduate group to establish undergraduate intake recommendations for 21-22, which will go to the Cabinet Secretary in the new year, and thereafter we will undertake further discussions with the SFC about the total number of places and their distribution across relevant courses. In Scotland, obviously, final decisions rest with the SFC in relation to individual institutions. But of course, a future growth in ScotGem places is something that would, of course, be under consideration in principle.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful additional information. And that now concludes the oral evidence on this bill, which the committee will take, and we will report to Parliament accordingly. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and can I thank her officials for your attendance this morning. We will now move into private session and resume our meeting at 11:55 on a different platform. I now suspend this meeting.